Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for bearing with us there. We'll have to put it down to the heat, a few tech gremlins. I'm so pleased that you've all joined us again. Thank you so much for being here. We've got two fabulous whiskies as always, but I don't know about you, but I'm quite keen for a dram. So I'm going to flip the coin to see if it's going to be heads for the traditional Scotch whisky or tails for the world whisky. And it's heads. So let's see who our first guest is. Oh, I told you there were some tech gremlins, but hopefully our first guest will be with us soon. There we go.
Here we go. How are you doing,
Hello.
James? You all right? Hello, how are you?
I'm better that you're now here.
Good.
I can wipe the stress sweat away. Could you introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from today, please?
Sure. So, my name is Murray Stevenson. I'm the UK sales manager with Lindores Abbey Distillery. So, I'm currently on my little home office here just now, which is in Auchtermuchty, just about sort of 10-15 minutes along the road from Lindores, which is in Newborough in Fife in Scotland, just on the south banks of the River Tay. So, not too far away from the distillery, which is a blessing and a curse, I guess. So.
And I wonder, for some of us who maybe aren't too au fait with the geography of Scotland, I wonder if you could mention some of the more maybe a larger city or town, or try and place us where we are in Scotland.
Absolutely. So we are about an hour north of Edinburgh. So we're not just on the south banks of the River Tay, the main part of the River Tay that's running between Perth and Dundee. So we are, in whisky terms, we're in the lowlands, but
Hmm.
only just. We're the most northerly lowland distillery. We're distilling just 3 meters into the lowlands. If you cross the little road from the still house into the Abbey ruins, you're crossing over into the Highlands in terms of whisky distilling. We're a little bit further north than some Highland distilleries because the way that the whisky line goes diagonally from the Clyde at Glasgow to the Tay at Dundee, it's kind of diagonally across the country, and we are just south of the sort of boundary line, sort of more than halfway up, just as you come up towards the mouth of the Tay, going into Dundee area. So we're just you can see Dundee across the water to the right, and to the left about 15-20 minute drive to Perth. So
I'm pleased you tackled that because sometimes it can be quite tricky looking at the different regions of Scotland, and yeah, that little lowland line does seem to kick up quite high. But
yeah,
there you go. It is what it is, right?
absolutely, yeah.
So I can tell that everyone is desperate to get tucked in. So I'd love people to start tasting their whiskies. Could you introduce the dram that we're going to try this evening, please?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to introduce the dram, we kind of have to introduce the history of the distillery altogether. But if everybody has it in front of them, perhaps have a little nose and a taste as you go. I don't want to keep you waiting too long with a history lesson before we tuck into the liquid. But have a little smell, have a little taste, and maybe in a few minutes we'll come back to the expectations that we would maybe have for tasting notes and things. But take yourself into the still house with us as we take a little bit of a journey back in time, because Lindores has such an incredible history behind it. We start our story all the way back in the 12th century, all the way back in 1191, when there was a group of Benedictine monks came across from a small village in France called Tiron-Gardais, where the mother abbey of Lindores Abbey still stands today, still operates today, called Tiron Abbey. So these monks came across and we were establishing some abbeys around Scotland. So you had Lindores Abbey and sister abbeys like Kelso and Arbroath coming at similar times. And my knowledge of what monks were doing in abbeys in these type of times was solely based on Friar Tuck from Robin Hood. That was really my only knowledge of what maybe monks looked like or were getting up to. Some portly lads shaving in some funny haircuts and maybe hitting their own wine stash a little bit too hard. But in order to be a monk at Lindores, you had to be at the very top of your game for a trade. You had to be worthy to be there. So there had been about 30 to 40 monks living and working at Lindores at any one time, bringing a wealth of skills to the area, and things like stonemasonry, agricultural work, beekeeping, fishing, all these kind of things, like your old school crafts. Um, and we, like where we are situated in Newborough and Fife, the land is very fertile there. So what didn't happen by accident, it was perfect on the south banks of the River Tay for transport, communication, trade, and very fertile land for growing and cultivating the land too. But we skip forward a little bit, a good bit in history, to the 16th century, where we have like the Reformation period in Scotland. So to put it as politely as possible, the country was going through changing its religious allegiances, perhaps, shall we say. So it was moving from predominantly Catholicism to a new Protestant way of Christianity. And with that, there was a lot of churches and abbeys destroyed and monks converting faiths. And it was a pretty dark, bleak time for a lot of people in history. And with that, you had big names in history like John Knox and his friends coming from Dundee to a big, important abbey like Lindores, and they laid waste to Lindores twice just to really make sure that they made a good job of it. So tapestries destroyed, books burnt, lots of monks killed, the building itself burnt and destroyed. So much mystery surrounding the abbey itself, of its goings on. We only have little snippets of history from old tax records, things like that, and inventory lists. But something really important, and over the years it became just like the back garden to the farmhouse of Lindores Abbey Farm, which had been in the Mackenzie Smith family since 1913, and blissfully unaware of any of its connections to whisky. Until the year 2000, a gentleman came knocking at the door of the farmhouse and asked if he could look around the back garden, which is where the Abbey ruins are. There's still some beautiful, complete archways, stone walls, all covered in trees and ivy, lost to history, lost to nature. It's kind of like a fairy tale like structure that you'd come across in a storybook. But this gentleman said, "Can I have a look around the back garden?" Which happens a lot now, but didn't happen then. And it was Drew's dad, Ken, who was at the house at the time, and he watched this gentleman from the farmhouse window as he took some pictures and took some notes, and he swears he saw him listening to the rocks and singing to himself. And Ken had said, "I'm just going to let this crazy guy crack on and not bother him for whatever he's up to." And the occasion was forgotten about until about a year later. The family received a beautiful hardback book to the house entitled "Scotland and Its Whiskies" by the late great whiskey writer Michael Jackson. So not our moonwalking Michael Jackson, but a lad who's known as the beer hunter, the whiskey hunter, and although he's passed now, he's still referred to as one of Scotland's greatest gifts to whiskey literature. We celebrate his birthday, we celebrate his life each year with an International Whiskey Day, things like that. And it was Jackson who had visited the Abbey ruins on that day, and in the flyleaf of his new book, it said, "Thank you, Ken, for letting me walk around your back garden. Turn to page 127 and onwards." And as the family opened that page, or that double page of the book, it had a bit of their back garden as a big picture in it. It was the Slipe, one of the complete archways. And at the title along the top, it said, "For the whiskey lover, it is a pilgrimage." The family were quite perplexed as to why their back garden was featuring in somebody's whiskey book. But as they read down, what was being discussed was a fairly recent discovery for the time, where somebody had been translating old tax records in a museum in Edinburgh called the Exchequer's Rolls, the tax records of the kings. And they found, translating from Latin into English, they found a really important entry from June of 1494 that read, "To Brother John Corr, who is believed to be of Lindores Abbey, 8 balls of malt wherewith to make aquavitae for the king," for King James IV of Scotland. That is a commissioning to make what we would call the water of life, which in Latin is aquavitae, which in Gaelic and Gaelic in Scotland, Ireland, other parts of the UK, we started to call that Ushkabe or Ushkaba or Ushkabea, over the years shortened just to Ushki. And as the years went on, the translation of Ushki became whiskey. So why this was such an important discovery was for all of our poems and songs or stories or history books of our celebrated national spirit of whiskey. This was the earliest evidence we had to any distilling in Scotland. It predated any previous evidence of distilling. And it shone a limelight on Lindores Abbey as what is referred to now as the spiritual home of Scotch whisky. And just as Jackson put in those words in the book all those years ago, it has become very much a pilgrimage for whisky lovers from around the world to come and walk the same grounds as the monks of Lindores Abbey, to perhaps where some of the first whisky, if not the first whisky in Scotland was ever being made, or in its earliest form as aquavitae, kind of more of a botanical malt spirit in its earliest form. So this discovery was a catalyst of a dream from Drew Mackenzie Smith and his family to bring distilling back to such an important, iconic area for Scotland. And that dream took about 20 years to come into reality. And it wasn't until December 2017 that we started distilling again at Lindores Abbey for the first time in over 500 years. So it's been obviously an incredible journey bringing it all back, and we now have a beautiful range of single malt whiskey to share with the world. And we were coached along in the early days by iconic figures in the industry like the late great Dr. Jim Swan, who was the lead consultant at Lindores, and he sadly passed away before we started distilling. But his ideas and things for what we would become was the sort of blueprints of what Lindores could be, and fantastic figures like our distillery manager Gary Haggart and his team, picking up this mantle and moving forward with it. And now we have some hugely respected, multi-award winning bottles and liquid going around the world and just wowing people, not just with the history of the past, but the next chapter for Lindores, which is the liquid. So what we have in the glass tonight is our core classic single malt. This is our what we call our 1494, or what is on your pouches as MCDX CIV, which is the Roman numerals for 1494. It's 3 of our core cask types that we have at Lindores, which is all first fill casks of bourbon casks, STR red wine barriques, and Oloroso sherry butts. It's bottled at 46% ABV with no chill filtration, no added colouring, and we have some. We can discuss more about the operations and things behind it, but I encourage you to get your nose into it, have a little taste, and I can see some flavours and things popping up, which a lot of them I think are absolutely spot on. But maybe we'll have a little nose, a little taste, and see what people think. Somebody's saying they didn't catch any of the story, too busy enjoying the whiskey. Well, I won't go back to the very start there and say it all again. But as a recap, the spiritual home of Scotch whisky, home of some of the earliest evidence of any distilling, going back to the very origins of Scottish distilling, all the way back in 1494. And this is an expression that is our first single malt out of Lindores in over 500 years, and it's our core classic here. Soft, silky, honey fruit forward, and perfect little dram for this hotter weather we've been having, I think.
A fantastic nose. And I'd like us to discuss some of the flavours in a minute, but I think it'd be really helpful to just go back, because we kind of did touch on it lightly, but you did have some wonderful help when you started to craft kind of what kind of whiskey you wanted. So I wondered if you could go a little bit more into the gentleman that helped the distillery, but also we could maybe touch on STR casks as well.
Yes, absolutely. So
whiskey.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, we were incredibly fortunate to be blessed by the presence of the late great Dr. Jim Swan, who was extremely influential to the whiskey industry as a whole, especially to a lot of younger distilleries that have come on the scene over the past, say, 10 years. Some fantastic distilleries from England or in Scotland, places as far afield as like Taiwan with Kavalan were touched by the magic of the skills of Dr. Jim Swan. And one of his greatest influences to the industry, I would say, would be his skills in maturation. And when you're saying, the STR cask that I mentioned briefly when talking about the makeup of our whiskey that we have in the glass here, this is I guess a brainchild of Dr. Jim Swan and Miguel Martin from Spain. and it's a recipe for rejuvenating red wine barriques from Spain and Portugal. So people have been rejuvenating casks in the whiskey industry for a long, long time. And by when I say rejuvenating, I mean, what you can do is, if you have a cask that's been used for maturation for maybe a few times for whiskey and it's becoming a little bit tired, it's not giving you as much influence as you would like, you can, depending on the style of the staves and things, you can shave back the inside of the cask for the staves, bringing it back to fresher wood that will give you more influence. But when you think of the buzzword around the industry of STR, it's usually talking about these specific red wine barriques from Spain and Portugal with a certain recipe of what STR stands for is shaved, toasted, and recharred. So being shaved to a certain degree, toasted and recharred to a certain character that is giving you this fantastic vessel to give an extra punch of maturity to a young single malt like Lindores. We've only been distilling since 2017. We can control a lot of the quality of our spirit by how we make like our new make spirit, which is a spirit coming off of the still. We can slow the process down and concentrate on making a fantastic new make spirit that is very forward thinking with like long fermentation times, which is like the beer making aspect of the dram. Slow, gentle distillation. At Lindores, we're using local Fife barley. We have a local borehole water source, which we pull water from 90 meters down just behind the distillery. We're using local Fife barley, and our fermentation times, industry standard for that would be about 50 to 60 hours. We're close to 120 hours a lot of the time. So double industry standard for our fermentation, which giving us really juicy fruit notes in what we call our wash, which is that beer part that is just water, barley, and yeast, which is just the three ingredients for making whiskey. And then we're then using that deep fruity wash to create a very fruity style spirit. And we have one wash still, and then we have what's called a twin sister spirit still set up that's allowing us to get very intelligent new make spirit. I think we're looking for really light fruity flavors from the spirit character. And you get a lot of that from being slightly cleaner with more copper contact. A lot of people maybe have a really, really tall spirit still, maybe with even an inclining line arm coming over the swan neck, which would be like the part that it looks like the end of the kettle that's kind of going and then would come down into your condenser. That creates extra reflux coming down into the still, creating more copper contact. But what a lot of people would have with that style would maybe be giving up on the mouthfeel. For the heavier style of the feeling on the palate. So at Lindores, we have two small spirit stills, but fed from the same low wines and faints tank underneath, getting double the copper contact that's there because they're smaller, more surface area. But we have quite steep declining line arms, so it's allowing some of the heavier compounds to come across, but we're getting the best of two worlds that is very difficult to get unless you have this style of setup, which is the light fruity characters, but that soft, silky, creamy nose, creamy palate to the dram, which I think just elevates Lindores above so many other styles of whiskey and spirit, especially for its age. A long-winded way to talk about STR casks there, but where the STR casks come into the mix is they're a great vessel for young whiskey to get some of the elements of maybe like virgin oak, which would be a cask type that has not matured any whiskey or any other spirit, and it can give you almost a quicker feel of maturation. Lots would argue that only time can be maturation, but certain things can affect maturation in a different way. And by rejuvenating the cask in this way, you're getting a lot of elements from some of the wine that was in the cask before, and a lot of access to that fresher oak to give a huge punch of maturity to that young spirit as well. So we can release whiskies like the combination of the fantastic spirit with these styles of cask. We can maybe release whiskies at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old that can stand shoulder to shoulder or often outshine whiskies twice or even 3 times its age. So the whiskey in the glass for our 1494 here has been one of the highest accoladed single malts around the world for some of the most prestigious awards around the globe. going into category of 12 years and under, and very often coming out on top with not just a bronze or a silver medal or even a gold, but a double gold or a gold outstanding, meaning everybody on the panel judging it blind as a 12 and under dram, giving it a gold medal. So the liquid in the glass is actually only about 4 years old. And if you were to speak to somebody, say 10 years ago, about drinking a 4-year-old whiskey, the anticipation would maybe be, oh, it's going to make my ears steam or my eyes water, or my throat burn. I don't touch anything under 10. But I'm delighted to be part of Lindores that is helping to re-educate the world that not everything is about the age and the craft and the way that you make your whiskey. You can have something here at 4 years old that is soft, it's silky, it's honey fruit forward, it's got lots of fruity character there, and it's effortlessly easy drinking. I would, without encouraging any irresponsible drinking, I would describe this as almost quite sessionable in style for a whiskey. And I definitely don't mean jump on a session and go and get drunk. That's not what I mean. I mean more, certain drams make you feel like you could only have one or two as a nightcap on a cold wintry night. But we're having warmer weather at the minute, and I feel that this suits a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. Group of friends, you can pour, again, drink responsibly, but you could have a good few of these, and it doesn't have an intense burn or a massive shock to it. I just think it's really moreish, really silky and soft, and just very, very fruity. Perfect for people who are well versed in whiskey as a lovely go-to, again, dram, but also fantastic for people very new to the industry as well, where it's not intimidating in any way. You know, great for a hip flask, great for a wedding, for a party, taken to the rugby or to going fishing or golfing, or taken to a funeral, whatever you wish. It's a great all occasion dram for all months of the year. So yeah, slag.
Oh yeah, well it's a lovely.
Probably the longest winded thing of talking about an STR cask of all time there. Apologies
No,
for that.
it's fabulous.
I love it. I absolutely love it. This one, I love it.
And I have been lucky enough to visit the distillery, and I am something I would encourage everyone to go, because when you go to the still house, and you can look at the stills that you mentioned, but the still house actually looks out onto the Abbey, which I think is a really nice touch, and it's really lovely to get that aerial view of the ruins. I wondered if you could touch on the logo, its meaning, but also I know that you do something quite unusual in the local landscape with your logo once a year, and I think it's a wonderful story. I hope you could share it with us.
Yes, absolutely. So if I bring the bottles in for you just now, I guess, and explain what's going on here. So what some people might be familiar with seeing this is our core classic bottle here, which is what you have on your pouch that says MCDX CIV. So this is what has been our kind of core classic design of the bottle here. We're right in the midst at the moment of doing a little bit of a transition into our kind of new style here, purely because we want the story and the liquid and the bottle to connect with people a little bit more easy. So, you know, it's wonderful when it's in the right hands for people, like in this setting, to say MCDX CIV means 1494. Spending 20 minutes talking with some friends about the history, but what we've transitioned to is just to make it that little bit more clearer. So no more Roman numerals on the bottle for it there. It's in your face. It's 1494. Lindores Abbey, and it's got a beautiful kind of mural drawing of the anticipated look of what the Abbey would have looked like. And this was done by a group of people who are historical artists and archaeological teams from Edinburgh and St Andrews University, who come back each year for a dig around the ruins of the Abbey and find some fantastic things each year that they do sponsored digs with their students there for a month or so each summer. But the logo is the bear and the L here. And it's inspired from what has been the logo of Lindores Abbey over the centuries, and then of the village of Newborough, which is the bear and the ragged staff. So it is the image of the bear kind of leaning up against like a kind of ragged sort of stick-like tree. the local kids of Newborough, I think, were probably brought up in primary school being told that a giant bear came one day and to the town, and some local hero fought it off with a big stick, and that's why it's on their primary school emblem for their school logo. But it actually comes from Warwickshire, from the Earl of Warwick. So if anybody watching from around here, or part of this stream is from Warwickshire, you might recognise the bear and the ragged staff, and that is because one of the first abbots of Lindores, Abbey, back all the way back in 1191, was the nephew of the Earl of Warwick, and the Earl of Warwick gifted him, Guido was his name for the nephew, gifted Guido and the Abbey the use of the seal of the Earl of Warwick for the Abbey. I'm sure this was like a golden handshake for getting in upstairs, so I'm sure the Earl of Warwick at the time could live a life sinning away as much as he wanted, with the anticipation that when he gets in upstairs he can have a conversation with St. Peter or somebody and be like, oh, remember I gave my logo, my seal to that abbey up in Scotland, can I get in past the gate please? That would be class. So that has lasted through the centuries as the emblem of the abbey, and so then we have kind of adopted that into the seal or the emblem of Lindores Abbey, but using the L instead of the ragged staff. But we do have a 200-metre carving of the bear and the ragged staff on the hillside that overlooks both the abbey and the distillery. And each year, this was commissioned several decades ago for part of the fruit festival in Newborough, which some of the same fruit trees, orchards that were planted by the monks centuries in the past. Newborough has always been very famous for its orchard fruits and its jam festivals, things like that. So once a year, we would have the burning of the bear on the hill, and we now have that as a bit of a whiskey festival at Lindores, which we call it the Bear Burning Festival. No actual bears are harmed in this event, but the 200-metre carving of the bear on the hillside is set alight in the evening at the closing of the festival, and it burns for a good hour or so into the darkness, and it is very, very druidy, Wickerman-y kind of feel. There's no Nicolas Cage screaming about bees and honey, but it's such a spectacle, and it is beautiful. We maybe have to do more in other areas for offsetting our carbon footprint if we're burning a 200-metre carving with a diesel or kerosene perhaps, but we are a very green distillery in other ways, and sometimes you need to set some things alight to capture that imagery, I guess. But it's fantastic, and if anybody ever has the opportunity to join the Bear Burning Festival, it's usually sort of one of the weekends in May. It's a fantastic day and evening. It's always little mini Highland games. There'll be pipe bands and axe throwing and things, and lots of imbibing of fantastic whiskey and whiskey tastings and local cider tastings and things all happening. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I always love that story.
Yeah.
So I guess for my closing question, we've done, we've looked back and we've sort of seen how you develop, but I want to know what's the future hold for Lindores Abbey?
I think the future for Lindores Abbey is going to be really, really exciting, really vibrant. We're currently at a stage at the distillery that we're still new kids on the block here. The oldest whiskey we have in the warehouse is just 8.5 years old. So we've got such a journey ahead of us. We're very much in our infancy, but we released our very first whiskey in July 2021. So in some ways, we've been around for a few years now, and some people have become avid fans and bought every release we've done, like in the UK and around the world. We're making a big footprint now globally, but we are a small independent distillery. So we have a fantastic local small team, and everybody extremely passionate about what they do at the distillery. And many of them come through from grassroots level of having nothing to do with distilling our whiskey before. And we have some of our stillsmen, like Colin, who he came on as a gardener in the early days. His family have lived in Newborough forever, and he's grown up living in Newborough, and he was working as a gardener in the early days, and he showed an interest and a passion for wanting to know what was going on in the still house. So the distillery's always been very good at recognizing passion, especially from locals, and involving the local community, and nursing that passion and sending it forward. So apart from Gary, our distillery manager, there's the large majority of anybody working at distillery have come in almost at a novice level, and I've just been coached and nursed into the passionate craftsmen and women that they are now. And we have people like Lorena, our blender, who was over from Chile with her family, and she started making soup in the kitchen in the early days, and it transpired that she had a very highly respected food and compliance degree from Chile, and was fantastic at the nosing and tasting panel aspect of it. So she has over the years become our blender. She's our master blender at Lindores, So and just like I say, being able to nurse and coach these passions into the future, and see where we all go with it. And we will be aiming for that. I don't want to say it over two ways of saying we don't care about age statements, and we're excited to aim for a 10-year-old. But it's an important benchmark for any distillery to reach these, like, sort of iconic moments in their life. So it will be exciting to have some age statements out in the future, and have a 10, have a 12, a 15 and 18. But don't want to be going back too far, but it's really important for the first few years to be cautious about what you're using, because some people now, we have releases that are out now that are 6 years old and 7 years old and 8 years old for the liquid we're using. Some people maybe watching today even might think, well, if you are 8.5 years old now, why are you still playing around with 4-year-old whiskey for certain releases? And that's because we're so small, we have to protect a lot of the stock that we have, because if we use everything that is older now, we'll never be 10, or we'll never make it to 12 years or 18 or 21, because everything that we make in that first 2 or 3 years is your first of everything. So if you use up all of our stocks now, then like we might be 60 years down the line before we have a 20-year-old whiskey, and we don't want to do that. So we'll have some exciting age statements coming out in the future. We'll maybe move away from things like the STR casks as we get further down into our maturation journey, because the spirit will be a little bit older. But I think that the way that the world is seeing and respecting our whiskey at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, I think the world is our oyster a little bit for Lindores, and maybe set a new benchmark for what a 10-year-old whiskey can be. And part of this almost like punk rock era for new whiskey distilleries, especially from the lowlands, where you've got some other great distilleries around the country, like Lochlee and like Daft Mill, and like places even up over to some of the islands like Rassay and things that are small, younger distilleries, but making whiskey in a new way that is very respectful to the past of the traditional whiskey making, but things like the new make and things being made in a new innovative way that you can have whiskey at a younger age, that is fantastic. So what is it going to be like at 10, 12, 18 if it's so good and drinkable at 4 is super exciting. And to be part of something from the word go and look at a 25-year plan on a page like a few times a year with the distillery manager and things is mind-blowing. I think to think of some of these casks will be coming out in quarter of a century down the line, and some half a century down the line, is amazing, I think. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I do hope you can stay with us, because we'd love to bring you on at the end, and we'll have a chat with our other guests. But thank you so much. A lovely distillery and a wonderful story.
Absolutely, yeah, and I hope you've all enjoyed the dram as well, for everybody watching tonight. And yeah, I think I've seen a lot of the notes pop up, and I definitely agree with a lot of the tasting notes that are there. Very fruity, lots of orchard fruits, bit of citrus, some nice balanced spice in there, but great nose, great palate, silky soft, honey fruit forward dram.
Thank
Slange.
you so much.
Cheers, James. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you. Oh, wasn't that fascinating? What a great story and a wonderful dram. It was interesting talking about the STR casks um, and such a young whiskey showing so much promise. It's always nice to know the age statement on a bottle, but you shouldn't get too hung up on it. When people ask me about that, I say, well, imagine if you had some whiskey and you had a very, very tired cask that had nothing left to give, and you aged your whiskey in that tired cask for 20 years. It would be a 20-year-old whiskey, but I don't know if I'd want to drink that really. Right, hopefully we've got another guest, and hopefully they're going to join us now. Look at that.
James, good
Hello,
to see
David.
you. Apologies for the little glitches earlier, but I'm here and I'm
Oh,
ready to go.
fabulous. So good to see you. David, let's jump in. Which whiskey are you bringing to us today?
So we're moving away from Scotland. We're going across the Atlantic, and I have got Maker's Mark, but not just Maker's Mark. We are sampling Maker's 46 today.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're over in America. I wonder if we should maybe touch on what Maker's Mark is first, because I'm under the impression that Maker's Mark 46 is a step up.
Absolutely. You know what? I thought you might do something like that. So here on my other side,
Okay.
a bottle that we might all be more familiar with.
Yeah.
A bottle of Maker's Mark, the classic Maker's Mark. Now, Maker's Mark is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. So, if you are going to be a bourbon whiskey, you must be made in the United States of America. Your mash bill, the recipe, must have at least 51% corn in the mash bill. The other grains can be anything that you want them to be, as long as corn is your majority grain. Nearly all bourbons use a combination of barley and of rye as what is often referred to as the small grains, but they're also sometimes called the flavoring grains. And I think that's a great description of them because it gives you an idea that they matter. They're not just there making up the numbers, they're the flavoring grains. They contribute. So, got to be made in the United States of America, got to have at least 51% corn in the mash bill. When we distill, it's a maximum strength of 80% ABV. It goes into a cask at a maximum strength of 62.5% ABV. Let's not worry about those numbers too much at the moment, but let's worry about the cask. And in particular, because Murray was talking about those casks and their importance and what you do that's different and frankly funky at Lindores there. All bourbon must be, the law actually requires that it is stored in a new oak cask. New oak container is what the law actually says, that has been charred on the inside. So all bourbon must be matured in a new cask. This is something that helps to give bourbon as a category its character and its identity. One of the main reasons that bourbon is often perceived and often is a slightly sweeter style of whiskey is that new cask influence and the fact that it's charred. You char the inside of an oak barrel, you caramelize the natural wood sugars that are there in the oak, you caramelize those wood sugars, you concentrate the sweetness, you make it easier for the whiskey to pull the sweetness out of the oak over time. So you do all of these things, make it in the USA, 51% corn in the mash bill, maximum distillation strength of 80% ABV, cask entry strength of 62.5% ABV, and that cask has got to be new and it has got to be charred on the inside and it has got to be made from oak. You've got yourselves a bourbon. These are both straight bourbon whiskies. Check any bottle of bourbon in your local bar on the shelf behind you, wherever you have it. They will quite often, nearly always, be straight bourbon whiskies. And this is the bourbon industry's little guarantor of age. And there is a little rider clause I've got to go through here. There's a caveat here. If you age your bourbon for 2 years in those new casks, you can call it a straight bourbon whiskey. But you've got to put an age statement on the label. You've got to say it's 2 years old. If it's 3 years, It's a straight bourbon whiskey, but you've got to put an age statement on. You've got to say 3 years old or probably 36 months because, we all fall for the big number around here. But the moment you get to 4 years of maturation or longer, you don't need to put an age statement on the label. So you will see a lot of bourbon whiskies, like this bottle of Maker's Mark, saying it is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. There is no age statement anywhere on this bottle. But because it says it's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey with no age statement, you know it must have been aged for at least 4 years. Every bottle of bourbon that is a straight bourbon whiskey and no age statement, a minimum of 4 years maturation, which kind of ties in quite nicely with Lindores there.
Yeah.
But we're doing things in a very different climate in particular. So there are going to be a lot of differences here. Maker's Mark. Bill and Margie Samuels. They founded Maker's Mark in the early 1950s. They came from a distilling family. Bill Samuels, he was inherited the T.W. Samuels distillery, which still exists, is still a bourbon that's made. He hated the bourbon that they made. He hated all bourbon basically in the 50s. He found it harsh, he found it bitter, he didn't like it. He sold the distillery. He had the family recipe. He burnt it. He didn't want to make bourbon like that ever again. He tried to do lots of other things. Frankly, he was rubbish at everything else he tried to do. And Margie, his wife, said, listen, do the one thing you're good at. Make bourbon, but make it in the way that you want to make it. And so he did. There's one little bit of the maker's legacy, if you like, I want to talk about, and then I promise we'll get onto the 46 here. Nearly all bourbons use rye and barley as those flavouring grains. What Bill and Margie Samuels realised was they didn't like the influence of rye. They found that the rye gave a sharpness, a bitterness, that they didn't want in their bourbon. So what they did was find a recipe, and they found a recipe by baking dozens, hundreds of different loaves of bread, putting different grain combinations together. And what worked for them was a mash bill that was 70% corn, 14% barley, and 16% red winter wheat. No rye influence. Again, think of the bread analogy here. Rye bread, you've got a sandwich made with rye, it's really tasty, but it's got a spiciness to it. It's got a bit of a bite to it. You've got a sandwich made with a wheat loaf, it's much softer, fluffier. Still tastes great, but has a much easier approach. That's what we get with Maker's Mark. So, Bill and Margie Samuels made Maker's Mark, and this is what they did for years and years and years and years. They just made Maker's Mark. And in the 1980s, Bill retired, and his son, the very imaginatively named Bill Samuels Jr., takes over, and he keeps things going. He makes Maker's Mark. He just keeps making Maker's Mark. And he's getting close to his retirement. And he walks into a board meeting, and he goes, guys, I had a dream last night. Let me tell you about my dream. Scariest words in the English language. Anybody who wants to tell you what their dream was. Nobody wants to hear about anybody else's dream. And he walks into a board meeting to tell them about his dream. But his dream, he was being buried. It was his own funeral. And he was being buried next to his dad. And on his dad's tombstone, it said, Bill Samuels. He created Maker's Mark. Now that's a pretty fine epitaph to have on your gravestone there, I feel. And Junior is being buried next to his dad. And on his tombstone, it said, Bill Samuels Jr. He didn't cock it up. Because all he did for 30, 40 years was keep making Maker's Mark and doing it really, really well, but he just did what his dad had done. And he was like, guys, I want a legacy. And Maker's 46 is the result of that. So, this I hope is going to tie in really quite nicely with the cask story that Murray was telling. It's a very different story, but it's about the influence of the wood and what you can do when you need to try to be creative and you are time constrained. Those bourbon regulations, they're strict. You can't use casks that have been seasoned with another liquid or anything, or that you can work around it, but you don't want to. So Bill Samuels Jr. started experimenting lots and lots of different things. Well, what can we do? How can we play? And he spent a lot of time talking to the guys at the Independent Stave Company who make the barrels for Maker's Mark. And what they realized that they could do is take some barrels of Maker's Mark that were basically mature, were ready. It's a straight bourbon, must have been aged for at least 4 years. For Maker's Mark, it's 6.5. That's where we get the flavour that's right for Maker's Mark-ish, approximately around about that sort of time of maturation. We took some barrels of mature Maker's Mark, dumped the whiskey from the barrels, and in the middle of the barrels, inserted 10 thin extra staves of seared French oak. Now, not making the barrel bigger, I mean going right in the middle of the barrel, the whiskey gets put back in, the end gets put back on the cask, casks get put back into the warehouse. So we're still using oak, so that's fine, but although the law in the USA does stipulate it must be oak, and it doesn't stipulate where the oak comes from, all bourbon barrels are made from American oak, because why wouldn't you? So using French oak right in the middle of the barrel, and it's seared. It's given a very heavy char, but a very slow heavy char, which traps the tannins in the wood. So the tannins are trapped, but the other flavors can come out. So what we get with Maker's 46, and I'm going to lift my glass for the first time, but I do hope that everyone's been drinking while I've been chatting on about this here. So that quote's just come up. It's definitely much more interesting than the standard Maker's Mark, has much more going on. Yes, that's what 46 is about. And this extra maturation, it's only for about 9 weeks or so. It's such a ridiculously short period of time. The staves that go in are only about 2 feet long, they're only about an inch wide, and they're thin. But when we first created 46, it was only ever done in the winter months as well. We didn't want too much influence from the weather to draw the flavour out. We do now have a temperature-controlled warehouse that we use for 46. But what we get is something that's still Maker's Mark, but more. It's Maker's Mark that has been to the gym and been working out. It's Maker's Mark that's gone to university and got itself a degree. You've still got the softness that the wheat gives you. You've still got those vanilla notes. You've got the creaminess. You've got the caramel sweetness from those barrels. And it's all concentrated. And the French oak, even for that short period of time, gives you a little bit more. So we get there is a bit more spice here, but there's none of the bitterness that was such an anathema to Bill Samuels back in the day. So this I go back to Murray's, when's a great time to drink your Lindores? So what's a great way to drink your Makers? Makers, classic Makers, yeah, I mean, sip that's lovely. In a highball, maybe a whiskey sour, it's got a slightly more refreshing cocktail and drink. 46, now this is a sipping bourbon, but this in an old fashioned, this in a Manhattan, this has got the body, the flavor, the power to stand up, to really express itself in that style of drink. It is glorious on its own. One other thing, I kind of like this, I love this. So classic Maker's Mark, 45% ABV in the bottle. Maker's 46, 47%.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I've always wondered about that, but who am I to mention that?
Obviously, everything I am telling you is the gospel truth here. But I do know two different stories about why it's called 46. So I'm going to go with the one that I prefer.
Yeah.
And it is about Bill Samuels Jr. experimenting with the stave company and with the guys at the distillery and what can we do to get something that's different. And basically, they made 45 mistakes. And those 10 seared French oak staves going into the middle of the barrel were their 46th experiment. And that's why it's called Maker's 46.
Very good. Well, I like that one, so we'll stick with that one. I wondered, you did actually briefly mention there, you actually do have temperature controlled storage units. And I know you also do play around with cellar aging, but it'd be really nice to do a little bit more of a deep dive on storing whiskies in America, because it is different to what we have come to expect with Scotch
Yes.
whiskies.
Absolutely. So, and again, Murray set me up so beautifully for a lot of things here. It really did. So, when you're aging bourbon, you've got two major differences you've got to account for compared to aging Scotch whiskey. So the first is all the casks are new. So you're going to get a lot of flavour, but a lot of tannin from the wood. So you probably don't want to age bourbon for too long, because we're getting first go at all of that flavour. Now, also consider the climate in which we are aging bourbon in Kentucky. The reason that climate has such an influence, one of the reasons, is that in warm weather, the grain of the oak of the barrels, of the staves, will expand slightly. It allows the spirit in the cask to soak into the wood. Cold weather, that grain closes down, squeezes it back into the cask. Now, if you are in Kentucky in summertime, if you were to go to Kentucky now, I mean, one, don't. Two, if you were, it's going to be nudging 40 degrees Celsius. It's going to be so humid. And summers are stiflingly hot in Kentucky. The grain of those barrels in the warehouses, boom, it's opening like this. But I've been in Kentucky in February as well. And the temperature dropped to about -15, and an ice storm came down. I was meant to be visiting the Maker's Mark distillery, and I couldn't get there because they closed all the roads because it was too dangerous to drive. So it's not just that it's really hot in summer, it's that it's really hot in summer and really cold in winter. You've got this range of different temperature. So as your whiskey is maturing, it's soaking into the wood that's opening up like this, and then it's being squeezed back into the barrel in the wintertime. So you compare this with maturing whiskey in Scotland, where, and Murray and everyone else there, forgive me, but in winter in Scotland, when it is cold and it is wet and it is miserable, and in summer in Scotland, when it is cold and it's wet and it's miserable, and you're using second-hand casks, so the grain opens up slightly and it closes slightly. It opens up slightly. So either you need to allow longer for aging to take place, or you get creative and you do STR, for instance, as a way of allowing another layer of flavour to come into your whiskey. Now, we have the advantage of new oak. We have the disadvantage that it's not seasoned. It hasn't been marinated with another spirit or sherry or wine or anything the first hand. It's got to be a new cask. So there's a balance, the swings and roundabouts at play here. But as a general rule, bourbon is good, really good, somewhere between 6 to 9 to 10-ish years. I know there are some bourbons which are considerably older than that, and some of them are wonderful. Some of them might be considered somewhat chewy. So there is this sweet spot. And one other thing just to consider, lots of other things to consider. Let's try and limit myself to one here. Those Kentucky warehouses. Now, most Kentucky warehouses, certainly back in the day, are like 9 stories high. 3 layers of barrels on each story. They're big, big, tall warehouses. The top floor is probably anything like 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the bottom floor of the warehouse. In that Kentucky weather, whether your warehouses are painted white or painted black has a huge impact on how the whiskey matures. Whether your warehouses are built on a north-south axis or an east-west axis, and therefore the influence of the sun, how much sunlight shines on the roof of the warehouse over the course of a day, has a huge influence on the temperature and therefore the maturation of the whiskey in the warehouse here. These days, they're not allowed to build 9-story warehouses. And there's a really good reason why, James. And do you have any idea why it is?
No, go on.
It's that the Kentucky fire services no longer have ladders that are long enough to reach 9 floors high. So if there is a fire, so all new warehouses are limited in their height, and the constraint is how high can a Kentucky fire truck get its ladder.
I love that. What a great thing to know.
So aging, maturation is such a big part of the flavors of our whiskey. But on the one hand, sometimes people look down on bourbon as not being as good as Scotch is because it's not aged for as long. You wouldn't want to age bourbon for as long as Scotch whiskies for all of these reasons. But then also sometimes people think that young Scotch can't be good because it needs to be aged for a long time. And all of the chat and the reactions we've seen to the Lindores here, young Scotch can be vibrant and lively and just sheer damn fun. And when you play around with STRs, or when you're trying to do something funky and different with bourbon and using French oak staves in the middle of the barrel, when the creativity kicks in and the boundaries are pushed and the barriers are leapt, you can get some really, really great results coming through from it.
And I wonder if you could just give us a brief overview of, because I imagine some of us haven't had much exposure to some quality bourbon. What are the kind of flavour notes that we should be coming to expect from something like Maker's Mark 46?
So the classic bourbon flavour tasting notes, you're going to get some sort of that caramel sweetness. You're probably going to get a big hit of vanilla, and you're probably going to get a fair amount of citrus, quite a fresh citrus note, which are all flavours more associated with American oak as opposed to European oak, and the char on the cask is responsible for those caramel notes coming through. With the 46, you're going to get a bit more you are going to get a bit more spice, but it's like baking spices. It's the allspice, it's maybe a little bit of the ginger and mace coming through. It's not, I don't think, please disagree with me on this. So I know it's not so much of, say, the cloves that maybe you get from a more dominant European oak influence here. There's no sherry influence on the French oak staves we're using, so you don't particularly get the dried fruit notes. But yeah, that warmer baking spice, the sweetness in 46, I think maybe becomes slightly more honeyed rather than the caramel sweetness. I certainly think it's a slightly more complex sweetness than what can be a slightly one-dimensional sweetness in some bourbons. But I do think with 46, it is you get those extra layers of flavour, and that little extra complexity is what makes it such an interesting bourbon.
And it's something I think, predominantly in the UK, actually, we're a little bit guilty of not exploring enough, actually. I think there's some fantastic bourbons out there. Thank you so much for sharing your whiskey. I wonder if you could maybe give us a little hint of what we can expect from Maker's Mark going forward, but also you do some other interesting there are some other expressions from Maker's
Yes.
Mark we might want to look out
I,
for.
you know, you know, I can take a hint with the best of them around here, James. So one of the let's try and draw the parallel again. So, Lindores is about, the Abbey and your water source. Maker's Mark is based at Star Hill Farm, and for years and years, um, we were a distillery which had a farm attached. And more these days, and now it's Rob Samuels who's taken over, third generation. Um, we think of ourselves almost we're a farm with a distillery attached, and we're expanding as much as we can so we can protect our water sources, so that the land that we own isn't having fertilizer applied to it, so we're not getting runoff from that. So we are becoming more and more regenerative and as organic as possible. Maker's Mark is a B Corp distillery. I believe we are the biggest B Corp distillery that there is, and because obviously, the bigger you get, the harder it is to get your B Corp accreditation. But we've got it, and it is because of that. And one of the results of this, in particular driven by Rob's passion for the regenerative farming, is that we're making a whiskey that's not a bourbon for the first time ever. We have done last 2 years. We've released something called Star Hill Farm, which is a wheat whiskey. It's got no corn in it whatsoever. It does have some barley, but Rob pushed to the limit how much wheat could be there. And 2025, 2026, we're doing annual releases. They are quite deliberately different flavor profiles each year they come out. We're using both wheat and malted wheat, as well as using malted barley. They are such interesting whiskies. One of the things I love about it, when we talk about the wheat influence with Maker's Mark, it's the softness, the creaminess, the richness. It's the gentle nature of it. Star Hill Farm, the wheat whiskey, is big. It's got almost like a treacly sweetness to it. And this idea of softness is not at the forefront of this absolutely wheat-dominated wheat whiskey. So it's a really, really interesting thing that's happening. All the wheat's grown on the farm itself, on Star Hill Farm. It's a great little trip down a tangent away from classic Maker's Mark. We're still always going to make classic Maker's Mark. 46 is here to stay. The cellar aged is a variant that we're doing now. There's a cask strength Maker's Mark that's out there. We're building on the idea that started with these 10 French oak staves, and we're doing something called private selection. So with certain customers, we now offer them a choice of 5 different stave types, and they have to select 10 staves from these 5 different. So you could do 2 of each, or you could do 9 of one and 1 of one, or I believe that it's 1,001 possibilities with 10 different 5 different stave types, but 2 of each. So it's giving customers the opportunity to create their own variation on Maker's Mark. One last little thing on that, if I can. One of the best things I love. So there are lots of shops and bars and hotels who've created their own Maker's private selection. And we got some in the States, a number of celebrity chefs and people or big names in the bourbon industry to do their own private selection. And Rob asked Bill Samuels Jr., his dad, the creator of Maker's 46, to do his own private selection. And Bill Jr. had the opportunity to do whatever he wanted, and he took 10 seared French oak staves and put them in the barrel because he said, I got it right the first time.
Oh, that's so lovely. What a lovely story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm a big fan of Maker's Mark 46, and I do want to point out just there is my bottle of Star Hill Farm, and I think it is an absolute stunner. So I do encourage everyone to seek it out. David, thank you so much for sharing Maker's Mark 46 with us. It was really, really lovely, and you'll just stick around as well, won't you? Just for a little
Absolutely.
bit. Thank you so much, David, and I'll see you in a minute. The thing, I say this every month, the thing that I love about doing this show is we never plan it, but there always comes a theme, and it's just one of those organic themes, and this time it was maturation. How fascinating to have two distilleries on either side of the world, both making different whiskies where maturation is so important. Hopefully we bring both of our guests back. Look at that.
Just like magic there.
Oh, so good. I love it when it's
seamless, James.
Here's to the magic.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your whiskies today. David, you've been on this show before, so you know the question I'm going to ask you in a minute. So you do have a little bit of prep. But David, you've also touched on your thoughts on Lindores Abbey. But do you have any final thoughts on this new distillery that's doing some interesting things with a fascinating story?
Nothing but to wish them the absolute best, because I've been on this a couple of times before. I've been around quite a long time, and one of the reasons I love being in the whiskey world is because new exciting things keep happening, and they happen because people are driven by passion and by love for what they do, and they want to create something different, but they want to create something that has a sense of place. They want to do something new but build on history, and whiskey at its best gives you all of this. And just listening to Murray talk about where Lindores Abbey has come from and what you're surrounded by, and name dropping like a trooper there. Oh, Michael Jackson said this, and it's just glorious. And this is about Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark is owned by Suntory. We are one of the big beasts in the whiskey world, and there's all sorts of advantages to that, and I love it. But I absolutely love the fact that you've got these the challengers, the independents, the stubborn, the damn mulish, who are just trying to do something that they believe in and that they love. And we've got to get whiskey out. We've got to do it when it's 4 years old. But how do we make it interesting? We'll tell you what, we're going to listen to Jim Swan. It's just brilliant. I love it.
Thank you. And Murray, Maker's Mark, classic, and then we've moved on to Maker's Mark 46, developed it further. What's your thoughts on that and hearing that story?
Fantastic. My background it was from hospitality. So I grew up through my sort of adolescent years working in various bars. I had my own, with a friend of mine, had their own sort of cocktail bar and events company. Maker's was always a staple. A fantastic bourbon for dozens of different cocktails, from spring summery juleps in the summertime for refreshers, like stunning easy highballs, into your more deep and complex sort of old fashions for the wintry months and things as well. So I don't think you stumble on too many bars that take themselves seriously that doesn't have a bottle of Maker's on the back bar. So it's a fantastic bourbon to play with, very versatile and great kind of like core staple for bartenders, to be honest. So I have nothing but like good things to say about and as working in Scotch whisky, we owe a whole lot of gratitude to the bourbon industry in general altogether, because the predominant cask we use in Scotland for maturing our whisky is ex-bourbon casks. So the industries of what Scotch whisky is now doesn't exist without the connections and the friendships with our close allies in the bourbon industry. So they go hand in hand. And yeah, like you touching on being a bigger company, a bigger brand, with the kind of mother company. There's lots of small names that are and other people, fans in the industry, that are quick to kind of like poo-poo some of the bigger brands and things. But again, we don't exist without them being there. We rely massively on their global marketing budgets to entertain the world of and introduce the planet to what whiskey is, and then onto what Scotch whiskey is. And then when people fall in love with brands like these, like with Makers, and then with other aspects of their portfolio, then they start seeking out smaller, quirkier things like Lindores. So again, we don't exist without the big names. So I have as much admiration for them as I do with our smaller guys who are like fighting the good fight for the small independent names. But yeah, it's fantastic to hear your insights to the distillery, the stories, and again, I guess that's what makes not just Scotch whisky exciting, but all styles of whiskey across the world exciting, is that community and storytelling aspect that goes hand in hand with whiskey. So be it like a nice summer wedding, you're having a fantastic easy drinking highball and you're having fun with it, or those more kind of intimate kind of evenings like we're having tonight, where we're drinking neat spirits and we're sharing stories and we're learning about names and epitaphs and gravestones and historical moments and things like that. It's what drives the whole industry. It is that camaraderie and passion between human beings, and it's great that we can do it like this and reach so many people on a wider scale. But I think that the bricks and mortar shops and things that you guys have as well are so important for keeping that sort of human element to it all as well. So I would always finish always on tastings and things that I do anywhere around the country of support your local shops and get in there and lean on the expertise of people like yourself, James, the Exeter shop, and because not every product it belongs on the supermarket shelf just as a yellow label like that'll do for this evening. Some things demand that story behind it to engage with that end consumer, and I think both of these products tonight have done that. I think there's been wonderful stories all around, and it's been brilliant. I loved it.
Thank you so much. So the tradition is I normally ask, where do you think the whiskey industry is going? But David, you've asked this before, so actually I'm going to ask you, where do you want to see it? What do you want to see happen? What do you wish will happen in the whiskey industry?
I would love the focus that has slipped a little bit maybe to people looking at whiskey as collectible and an investment. I want whiskey to be drunk.
Nice. What a fantastic way to end the evening. And Murray, how about you? What do you want? Where do you want to see the whiskey industry go?
I mean, exactly the same. Like we make good liquid that we're really proud of. It's as somebody who works in sales for whiskey, don't get me wrong, it's lovely to sell bottles of whiskey regardless of where they're going. And if people want to partake in, human beings are human beings, and people collect stamps and stuff. If people want to collect bottles of nice whiskey to look at, that's great. I have some in a collection, and that I'd be hypocritical to say that you should never do that, because some people like to do it. But at the end of the day, it's a product that's there to be drunk and enjoyed and opened and discussed, and then there's nothing more. It's really good to sell a bottle of whiskey and to see them being sold, but there's nothing better for me than people sharing bottle kill shots of an empty bottle online with a bit, another one bites the dust kind of thing, and on to the next. Because if something is good and is like I was saying, a staple for a bar, like you don't want a bottle of Makers sitting gathering dust on the bar shelf. You want it to be consumed and enjoyed, and you want that person to want to buy the next one and the next one, always with responsible drinking, of course. But you want that next one there. But as the industry as a whole, there's loads of negativity around like sort of whiskey news outlets and things at the moment, because negativity sells. You know, that there's lots of eye-catching headlines and stuff. Oh, so and so closes, or so and so does this, but there's so many positives still going on, and there's so many like new things and exciting things happening, that I think that the whiskey, if you look back in history, it's always been in waves. It's never just been a continuous climb and climb and climb. There's always been little periods where there's been little dips, and it comes back out and gets stronger than before, and dips a little bit again, and it's a bit of a roller coaster. There is a little bit of a global dip at the moment, for certain things. We did our first ever release during lockdown, and that, let me tell you, that was like the Wild West of selling whiskey. That was like, you know, people were at home and on furlough with like 80% of their normal wage. They couldn't go out. It created this weird bubble of collecting whiskey, and like, oh, I don't have anything else to do, so I'll go on 5 whiskey tasting seminars a week, and I'll buy 20 bottles a month and things. That is all. That was a weird and exciting time for a brand new brand like Lindores to come into the world with, but that first release, or that first single, like a band would bring your second single and your third single and then your album and stuff, that all has to be good as well. And I think that's what Lindores is doing. It had that kind of limelight peak of being a brand new release, but it's riding that kind of curve very well and becoming a nice staple for a lot of people. And we want to see the world become really positive again for whiskey, which I think it is. Will just be a slow little hike up. So I think it's going to be great. And
Very good.
yeah,
Nice. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your whiskies and your fabulous stories. And there's been some wonderful comments. I'm going to say goodbye to you both, and I'm going to close the show, but it's lovely to have seen you both. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Oh, there you go. Gosh, fascinating as always, and a really nice way to end the show there. I do think whiskey is meant to be drunk. It's wonderful to share whiskey with friends and family, so I encourage you to do the same. I believe that we might have some of these bottles for you to purchase, so if you love them, you probably love them both and you probably want to pick them up, do check your emails tomorrow morning and hopefully you can snap one up. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next month. Thank you. Bye.